My name is Adam, and I'm a hydrological engineer. For most of my life, that title has been a source of quiet pride, something I've used to help municipalities manage water resources and build sustainable systems. But in my little suburban community of Meadow Creek, that same title has apparently been reclassified as an act of domestic terrorism. I think I might hold the world record for the most absurd violation ever issued by an HOA: hoarding of natural spring water. Sounds ridiculous, right? What would you even do with hoarded spring water? Drink it all yourself? Put it on the black market? Let me know where you're watching from in the comments, and I'll tell you how this whole thing went down. This all started innocently enough. When I bought my house, I was drawn to the small, bubbling creek that ran through the back of the property, fed by a natural spring. The previous owners had let it fall into neglect, choked with weeds and littered with debris. It was a disgrace. So, with my specific skill set, I got to work. I spent my weekends charting the water flow, clearing out invasive species, and installing a series of small, permeable check dams to restore its natural path and prevent erosion. It was my passion project, a way to bring a little bit of wild, untamed nature back into our cookie-cutter neighborhood. The result was beautiful. The water ran clear and fast, small fish returned, and the sound of the babbling brook became the soundtrack to my life. I had no idea it was about to become the battleground for a suburban war. The first shot was fired in the form of a thick, beige envelope from the Meadow Creek Homeowners Association. It landed in my mailbox with a heavy thud, as if its weight alone could crush my soul. My antagonist in this story, and every story that followed, was Brenda, the HOA president. Brenda was a woman who saw the world in shades of beige, and who believed that all of life's problems could be solved with a finely worded bylaw. The letter, signed in her perfectly manicured script, informed me that my unauthorized water diversion project was in direct violation of Article 7, Section 4, Subsection B, and was negatively impacting the shared aesthetic. It was just the first paper cut in what would become a 1,000-cut wound. What she called aesthetics, I called a thriving natural ecosystem. What she called water diversion, she would soon start calling something far more sinister. I had no idea at the time, but this was just the beginning of Brenda's delusion that I was somehow hoarding spring water. The meeting room smelled of stale coffee and suburban anxiety. Every face was a polished mask of indifference, a silent plea to avoid being the next target. Brenda, perched at the head of the table like a queen on her throne, opened with the usual formalities before turning her gaze directly to me. She didn't look angry, she looked triumphant. She had an audience. "As you know," she began, her voice dripping with an almost theatrical condescension, "we take our community standards very seriously. Which is why we've had to address the unauthorized and frankly unprofessional water diversion project at 1421 Briarwood." I could feel every eye in the room shift, but no one said a word. The silence was louder than any accusation. Brenda then launched into a narrative about my hoarding of water, using phrases like unnatural flow rates and detrimental aesthetic impact. She spoke as if my clear, flowing stream was a pile of old junk cars. When she finally paused for breath, I stood up calmly. I had a binder with me, filled with my professional documentation. "Brenda, with all due respect, what you're describing is the natural restoration of a spring-fed creek," I said, my voice steady and factual. I opened my binder to a topographical map. As you can see from the hydrological surveys I've included, I haven't diverted a single drop of water. I've simply cleared debris and restored the original flow path, which has improved sediment control and ecosystem health. I have a full report on the benefits for the entire community, including reduced flooding risks for properties downstream. I waited, expecting a debate based on facts, but this wasn't a debate. Brenda held up a perfectly manicured hand, not to silence me, but to dismiss me. "We've seen your studies, Adam. Frankly, the board finds them irrelevant. The fact is, you've created she paused for dramatic effect, a moat, a private water feature that draws the eye and devalues the communal aesthetic. It is a violation, and the board has moved to take corrective action." She gave me a thin, smug smile, as if she'd just delivered a checkmate. I looked around the room, hoping to find a single sympathetic face, someone who would dare to speak up. But they all stared at their hands, or at the beige wall behind her, silent. They were just as terrified of her as I was. It was in that moment I understood this was never about water. It was about control. The paper cuts began the very next morning. A new beige envelope arrived, and inside, a fine for my unapproved mailbox color. I'd painted it a dark, almost charcoal gray. Apparently, that was a shade that did not conform to the approved community palette. The next day, another notice for overly lush grass, indicative of unauthorized water use. It was the HOA's passive-aggressive way of telling me they were watching. Every car that slowed down on my street, every person walking a dog who paused to look at my house, it all felt like surveillance. This wasn't just a one-time confrontation. This was a campaign of harassment, 1,000 small acts of bureaucratic cruelty. I documented every single one. Brenda, it seemed, was not content to simply win the argument. She intended to starve me out with fines and bury me under a mountain of paperwork. She had her inner circle of volunteers walking the streets like junior inspectors, carrying clipboards and squinting at my yard. I saw them, an irony lost on no one but me, taking notes on their tablets about the aesthetic non-compliance of a property with a pristine, natural spring running through it. The absurdity of it all was almost comical, but the constant pressure was real. Then, the final, most ominous letter arrived. It wasn't in a flimsy envelope, but a thick, registered package. The postage alone was a statement. The letter itself was short, curt, and devoid of the usual HOA pleasantries. It informed me that since I had failed to self-correct my violation, the board had authorized the next steps. The language was cold, legal, and chilling. It mentioned corrective action and remediation and accessing the property to implement necessary modifications. As an engineer, those words hit me differently. To a layperson, they might sound like legal jargon, but to me, they were a technical blueprint. Corrective action isn't just mowing a lawn or painting a fence. It implies a physical engineered solution. Remediation means returning the land to a previous state, a process that requires heavy machinery and significant excavation. My professional alarm bells, the ones that usually go off when a project has a bad foundation, were screaming. Brenda wasn't just planning to find me anymore. She was planning to physically alter my property. She was going to do something drastic, and I knew, with the cold certainty of a surveyor's line, that it was going to be an act of war. I knew this wasn't a fight I could win with facts alone. Brenda had made that abundantly clear. I needed a new kind of expertise, a different kind of weapon. I found him in a quiet corner of Meadow Creek, a man named Henderson. A retired zoning attorney, he had a reputation for being the quiet, unassuming master of suburban legal battles. His office was a testament to his career. Stacks of old zoning maps, books on municipal code, and a quiet sense of lived-in wisdom. He listened patiently as I recounted the story, not as a homeowner complaining about his neighbors, but as a fellow professional presenting a case study. I showed him the letters, the fines, and the legalistic language that had set off my alarms. He picked up the last letter, the one mentioning remediation, and smiled a thin, knowing smile. "This is classic," he said, his voice a low rumble. HOAs, like any other small government, use broad, vague language to give themselves maximum authority. It's written with one purpose: to give them a legal cudgel. Negative aesthetic impact, non-conforming use it, all means whatever Brenda decides it means on any given Tuesday. My heart sank a little. So I don't have a case? He shook his head, a gesture of quiet confidence. On the contrary, that's also their greatest weakness. They have to operate within the bounds of city ordinances, state law, and common sense. When they use it to justify an action that violates building codes, environmental regulations, or trespass, they have overstepped. That's when you strike. He leaned forward, his expression suddenly serious. This isn't about winning a debate. It's about a clear, precise, and documented takedown. You have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that they are planning to do something illegal, and you do that by documenting everything, every threat, every letter, every interaction. You become a one-man forensic accounting team. You need a paper trail so impeccable, so irrefutable, that it looks like it was created by an audit team with a vendetta. I left his office with a new mission. I was no longer a homeowner fighting my neighbors. I was an engineer, beginning a new project, a full-scale forensic investigation into the legal and structural vulnerabilities of a tyrannical HOA. I had the tools of my trade, a new legal directive, and the righteous anger to see it through. The moment I left Mr. Henderson's office, the case was activated in my mind. The endless stream of fines and threatening letters from Brenda's HOA was no longer a source of personal frustration. It was raw data. I began to approach my home as I would any professional project, a site in need of a full-scale forensic audit. My first order of business was to establish a perfect, irrefutable chain of evidence. I spent the next several days quietly mobilizing my resources. I ordered a series of discrete, high-definition cameras and motion sensors, the kind used for wildlife monitoring. My goal wasn't to catch a squirrel. It was to document every vehicle, every person, and every action near my property line. I mounted them in places Brenda's inner circle would never think to look. Inside a hollowed-out birdhouse, nestled in a hanging planter, and disguised as a solar-powered garden light. I ran the wires myself, burying them neatly along the foundation of the house and feeding them into a secure, redundant server in my basement. My professional life had taught me that when you're dealing with a project that could go sideways, you plan for every single contingency. With the perimeter secured, I turned my attention to the paper trail. I created a physical binder and a digital file on my secured drive, which I titled Project Meadow Creek. Each new notice from the HOA was immediately scanned, logged, and filed with a meticulous, date-stamped entry. I began a detailed journal, not just of events, but of my own thoughts and observations, recording everything in the calm, factual style of an engineer's notebook. The goal was to build a case that was so comprehensive, so unassailable, that it would stand up to any legal challenge. I transcribed Brenda's most arrogant quotes and noted every single time her task force drove by my house. I was no longer just the hydrological engineer up the hill. I was now a private investigator, a data analyst, and a legal archivist. The HOA was a predictable system, and like any system, it had a point of failure. I was simply documenting their every step toward it. After weeks of a constant barrage of beige envelopes and petty fines, a strange and unsettling quiet settled over Meadow Creek. The drone of Brenda's HOA task force was gone. No more cars parked awkwardly at the end of my street. No more cameras pointed subtly at my front yard. No more notes taped to my mailbox about the height of my lawn. It was a silence so profound it felt like a deliberate act, the quiet before a grand finale. My engineer's mind, a thing trained on patterns and anomalies, knew this wasn't a sign of peace. It was a sign of planning. A feeling of dread began to crawl up my spine. My gut, a second set of analytics, told me that Brenda and her inner circle had moved from the trivial to the tactical. They had stopped trying to annoy me into submission and were now preparing for a final, decisive assault. Late one night, my perimeter motion sensors, the ones I'd disguised as little garden gnomes, sent a notification to my phone. I didn't see anyone, but I saw the headlights. A black sedan, not from our neighborhood, drove slowly past my property, pausing for a moment before disappearing into the night. It happened again the next night, and the night after that. Sometimes it was a nondescript white van. Other times, a beat-up pickup truck. They weren't trespassing, but they were conducting a different kind of survey. They were casing the joint. They were professionals, or at least they were hiring professionals. A cold, methodical calm settled over me. This was no longer a game of bureaucratic back and forth. This was something far more serious. I went to my basement and double-checked my redundant power sources, ensuring the server that was logging every minute of video footage was securely backed up. I ran a diagnostic on all my camera systems and verified the motion sensor alarms were fully functional. Every cable, every wire, every piece of my professional-grade perimeter defense was exactly where it should be. The enemy was on the move. They were about to make their grand gesture, and I was going to be ready for them. The low, persistent beep of my phone cut through the deep silence of the night. Not a shrill alarm, but a quiet, digital notification. Perimeter breach. I sat up in bed, my mind instantly shifting into professional mode, running through a mental checklist of my security systems. I didn't reach for a baseball bat or a phone to call the police. I reached for my laptop, pulling up the live feeds from my cameras. The first view was of the street, bathed in the sickly yellow glow of a single lamppost. Then, a new kind of light, a convoy of vehicles, not just one or two, but a whole procession, turning onto my street. They were massive. Black sedans with tinted windows, followed by a procession of white pickup trucks, and, most horrifyingly, 2 large dump trucks and an excavator. The air filled with the low rumble of heavy diesel engines, a sound so out of place in our manicured suburb that it felt like a violation. This wasn't a warning. This was an assault. My cameras, placed to capture the most minute detail, showed the orchestrated chaos. Men in high-visibility vests and hard hats, moving with a practiced professional efficiency. They placed cones and string, their movements precise and without a single wasted motion. They were not amateurs. They were professionals, hired by Brenda and her board to do their dirty work. They moved to the outer edge of my property, a few feet beyond my fence line, and began. The excavator's metal teeth bit into the soft earth of my yard, tearing up the soil I had so carefully cultivated. The sound was a sickening, grinding roar, followed by the deep rumble of dirt falling into the dump trucks. My stomach clenched, not with fear, but with a cold, righteous fury. They weren't coming for my mailbox or my overgrown grass. They were coming for the land itself, believing they had the authority to do so. I watched in a surreal disbelief as the flashing red and blue lights from a single security vehicle painted the concrete walls of my neighbors' homes, a silent, empty threat. This wasn't a fine, or a lawsuit, or a dispute over bylaws. It was a direct, physical act of aggression, and I was going to be ready for them. The night passed in a blur of motion and sound. The floodlights the crew had brought in bathed my property in a harsh, artificial glare. The rhythmic beeping of the dump trucks backing up, the roar of the concrete mixers, the scrape of shovels against metal, it all became a grotesque mechanical symphony of my confinement. I remained at the window, a silent, unmoving observer, documenting the process not just with my cameras, but with my mind, cataloging every detail of their trespass. They didn't just dig a trench. They were building a monolith. Using prefabricated concrete panels, they were constructing a solid, 8-foot-high wall around the entire perimeter of my property. It was methodical, chillingly efficient work. As soon as the sun began its slow crawl over the horizon, painting the sky in soft shades of orange and pink, the full scale of their audacity was revealed. The soft glow of dawn did not soften the sight. It only illuminated the harsh, brutal reality. My manicured lawn and peaceful home were now surrounded by a gray, imposing fortress. A concrete fence with no gate, no door, no visible point of entry. The foreman, a burly man with a permanent scowl, finished the last section. He wiped his brow. His eyes met mine through the window. He didn't look angry. He looked satisfied. A thin, self-righteous smirk spread across his face. He held up a piece of paper, a legal-looking document, and gave me a single, triumphant wave, as if to say, "It's all right here. We're well within our rights." He had a piece of paper, but I had the truth. In that moment, with the light of a new day revealing my new prison, the full scope of their action hit me. They had taken the vague language from the bylaws corrective action, remediation, and interpreted it in the most literal, most brutal way possible. They hadn't just trespassed. They hadn't just fined me. They had built a wall. And I was completely, utterly walled in. The sound of the spring still bubbled nearby, but I couldn't reach it. The suburban world, with all its trivial anxieties and pointless rules, was just on the other side of a solid, concrete barrier. I woke up to a silence so complete and profound it was almost deafening. The roar of the engines, the beeping of the trucks, the grinding of the machinery, it was all gone. The house felt like an airtight chamber, sealed off from the world. I got out of bed, the floor feeling solid beneath my feet, and walked to the kitchen to start my coffee, a routine act that felt jarringly normal. The sun was streaming in through the window, but something was off. The light was harsh, without the usual filter of my trees and the hedges. I walked to the living room window, preparing myself for the sight of the concrete wall. The wall was there, just as I had left it, high, imposing, and unforgiving. But something was wrong with the perspective. The bottom of the wall, which should have been at ground level, seemed to extend far below me. I walked closer to the glass and peered over the windowsill. My breath caught in my throat. The ground was gone. My manicured lawn, my garden beds, the very earth itself had been excavated. The house was no longer on ground level. It was perched on a small, isolated island of dirt, surrounded by a chasm. I was in a hole. This wasn't just a simple wall. This was a massive, deliberate, and deeply stupid engineering project. The remediation Brenda had mentioned in her letters was a full-scale excavation around the entire foundation of my house. The crews had dug down, creating a 10-foot-deep moat of empty space between my property and the surrounding neighborhood. It was their ultimate, ridiculous move to cut me off from the spring, which they believed was running underground and feeding my foundation. They had physically isolated my home, not just with a wall, but by removing the very ground it stood on. They were so convinced I was hoarding water, they tore up the entire landscape to get to it. The smug look on the foreman's face, the wave of the legal document, it all made sense now. They thought they had legally, physically, and professionally cornered me. They didn't just build a wall to keep me in, they built a prison. I was a professional, an expert in water flow and land management, and I knew with a chilling certainty that they had just created a massive hydrological and structural liability for themselves. I was trapped, but they were about to realize they had trapped themselves far worse. The silence of the next morning was absolute, a heavy blanket that smothered all sound from the outside world. I walked around the perimeter of my small, isolated island of land. The car, my only real means of escape, was a useless shell, a metal tomb trapped 10 feet below the level of the surrounding street. I could see the sealed gates of the driveway, the hinges welded shut, and the smooth, impassable concrete of the wall towering above me. The HOA hadn't just built a barrier. They had completely and systematically cut me off. I looked up at the wall, at the seamless, featureless concrete, and a cold clarity settled over me. This was their strategy. They believed that by creating this physical barrier, by isolating me and my resources, they had starved me of options. They thought I would be forced to comply, to beg for their mercy, to agree to whatever ridiculous demands they had concocted. They believed I would be weak, that I would break. They were so tragically wrong. I took a deep breath, the air in my little crater smelling of fresh earth and concrete, and began my first professional assessment. I had faced bigger problems in my career, more complex sites, and more unmovable obstacles. This was just a new project with a unique set of constraints. I began to mentally inventory my assets. My pantry was well stocked with canned goods and non-perishables, more than enough available consumables for weeks. The spring, which was the source of all this conflict, gave me an infinite supply of fresh, potable water, which I could filter for any necessary use. My professional-grade equipment, my cameras, my redundant power systems, my tools, all of it was still within my area of operation. This wasn't a prison, it was a laboratory. And they had just provided me with a controlled environment to prove my case. They had tried to break my spirit with a wall and a hole, but all they had done was given me an undeniable piece of evidence. I wouldn't be begging for compliance. I would be documenting their crime. And when I emerged, it would be on my terms. I spent the next several hours in the silent, damp crater that was once my lawn, meticulously mapping the site. My professional training had taught me that no matter how chaotic a situation, There is always a logical flow, a pattern to be found. As I moved along the base of the freshly dug pit, tracing the outline of my isolated island of land, I noticed a subtle anomaly. A small, perfectly straight line of discolored earth and a faint difference in the texture of the soil. It was the kind of detail a layman would never notice. I dug into the soft earth with my trowel and found what I was looking for: a small, bricked-over opening, clearly not part of any modern residential system. The opening was just big enough for a camera lens, but far too small for a person. I reached into my bag and pulled out a small waterproof scope, a tool I usually reserved for inspecting pipeline interiors. I slid the camera past the loose bricks and turned on the small LED light at its tip. What I saw was not a drainage pipe or a simple culvert. It was a perfectly preserved section of a much older, much larger subterranean network. The walls were lined with smooth, worn bricks, and the air felt still and heavy. This wasn't part of the Meadow Creek utility plan. This was something else entirely. With a cold, calculating certainty, I realized what I was looking at. In their rush to remediate my property and sever what they believed was a rogue water source, Brenda and her hired crew had unknowingly tapped into an old, forgotten municipal utility network. They had, without a permit or a single moment of professional due diligence, breached a section of the city's old infrastructure. They weren't just violating HOA bylaws or trespassing. They were committing a massive legal and financial offense. This wasn't a property dispute anymore. This was a direct, illegal assault on city-owned property. Their arrogance had led them to believe they could act with impunity, but in their haste, they had made a mistake of professional proportions. I had just found the key that would blow this whole thing wide open. My engineer's mind had already assessed the problem. My physical confinement was a constraint, but my digital freedom was still absolute. The solution was simple. I retrieved a small, personal drone from my toolbox. It was a professional-grade model, quiet and agile, capable of flying in tight spaces and capturing high-definition video. After a quick battery check and a calibration of its GPS, I placed it in the center of my small, isolated island of land. With a single tap on my tablet, the little drone whirred to life and ascended. As the camera feed appeared on my screen, I watched with a cold satisfaction as the little machine rose, clearing the top of the concrete fortress that now held me captive. The perspective was immediate and staggering. From the ground, the wall felt like a prison. From the air, it looked like a ridiculous, monstrous absurdity. My little piece of property was a perfect, square hole in the middle of a neat, suburban grid. The footage was pure, damning B-roll. The monstrous concrete wall, the freshly churned earth of the pit, the incongruous sight of a single house sitting in a chasm in the middle of a perfectly manicured neighborhood. It was the visual proof I needed. My focus shifted to the street, and there they were. A small gathering of Brenda's inner circle, all standing proudly by the newly constructed wall, admiring their handiwork. Brenda herself was at the center, a perfectly tailored figure of triumphant self-satisfaction. The drone, now a quiet digital ghost, hovered over them, its lens a cold, unblinking eye. I zoomed in on her face, and her smug, overconfident smile filled the frame. She was gesturing at the wall, her lips moving, no doubt bragging about their victory to her sycophants. I held my breath, the little drone a silent witness to their hubris. The footage I was capturing was my first piece of truly solid evidence. It was an objective, irrefutable record of their crime. Brenda could deny all she wanted, but she couldn't deny the video. The drone quietly landed back on my grass, its mission complete. They had built a wall to keep me from the world, but in doing so, they had given me the perfect vantage point from which to expose them. The drone footage was one thing, but I needed to know their full scope of operations. I needed to know if they were still watching. My engineering work often involved a deep understanding of network architecture and security vulnerabilities. I knew that consumer-grade, off-the-shelf surveillance systems, the kind an amateur organization like the HOA would purchase, are notoriously insecure. They often have factory default passwords and hidden backdoors. I went to my server, the one that was meticulously logging every byte of data from my own cameras, and began to scan the local Wi-Fi network. I wasn't looking for a broadcast from a camera. I was looking for a pattern, an open port, a telltale IP address. It took less than 15 minutes. There it was, a connection to an unsecured IP address, likely a small dedicated hub for their cameras, broadcasting its presence to anyone who knew how to look for it. The irony was almost too perfect. They had built a physical wall to keep me out, but they had left a digital door wide open. I bypassed their laughably simple login and got in. The screen filled with a grid of live feeds. To my cold professional eye, the cameras were poorly placed, their angles wide and inefficient. I could see the street, the entrance to the neighborhood, and my house. Not just a distant view, but a high-definition, live feed focused directly on my property, or rather, what was left of it. I watched a pixelated version of myself walking the perimeter of the hole I was in, and then I saw the other screen. It was a feed showing the inside of what looked like the HOA clubhouse, a room I knew well from all the meetings. On the screen was Brenda, a small, triumphant figure sitting at a desk with a laptop open. She was surrounded by a few of her loyal lieutenants, all of them laughing, pointing, and toasting with small paper cups of water. They were watching me. They were watching me walk the perimeter of my concrete prison, gloating over my confinement. The smug look on Brenda's face was more than just arrogance. It was a personal attack, a deep, vindictive pleasure. In that moment, the righteous indignation I had felt for the past few weeks solidified into a cold, hard resolve. This wasn't about a water dispute, a legal quibble, or even a community project. This was a direct, malicious act of cruelty. I wasn't just fighting a bureaucracy anymore. I was fighting a personal vendetta, a quiet war waged by a woman who had mistaken arrogance for authority. And now, thanks to her amateur mistake, I knew exactly what I was up against. My immediate priority was to get the evidence I had gathered to the outside world. My digital access was still a viable channel. I drafted a concise, professional-grade report, attaching the raw drone footage of the wall and the visual evidence from my security cameras. The email was addressed to a single person, Mr. Henderson, the retired lawyer who had given me my initial directive. It was a simple message, devoid of emotion, like an invoice with a shocking attachment. Dear Mr. Henderson, please find attached a brief summary of the HOA's corrective action. Your previous advice has been invaluable. I believe this constitutes a significant violation of municipal code. His reply came a few hours later. It was short and to the point. Good heavens, Adam, I'm on it. But his actions spoke louder than his words. He immediately began to contact his own network, and through him, I was able to make contact with a few sympathetic neighbors. They weren't the outspoken type. They were the reluctant allies I had hoped for. People who had long suffered under Brenda's tyrannical rule but had been too afraid to speak up. The wall, however, was a step too far, a visible, monstrous act of public insanity they could no longer ignore. We established a secure, encrypted messaging group, and I began to delegate tasks as I would on a new engineering project. I didn't ask them to climb the wall or confront Brenda. I gave them jobs they could do quietly, a form of righteous sabotage. I asked them to go to the city's building and planning department and request all permits issued to the Meadow Creek HOA for the last 3 months. I told them to look specifically for any permits related to structural remediation or major excavation. One of my new allies, an accountant by trade, was tasked with digging into the HOA's budget to see where the money for this colossal project was coming from. They were shocked, but also invigorated. They had a mission, a way to fight back without getting their hands dirty. They saw the injustice, and now they had a way to document it. Brenda and her board were so sure of their power, so convinced they could act with impunity, that they never imagined the people they had ruled over for years would band together and begin the methodical, painstaking work of their eventual downfall. The first digital transmission came in, a series of encrypted documents from my allies. The files were a mix of blurry scans from the city clerk's office and PDFs downloaded from the municipal permit portal. I opened them on my tablet, the screen glowing in the perpetual shadow of the concrete wall, and began my analysis. My eyes scanned the documents, searching for the specific technical language I knew would be there, or, more accurately, the language that was not there. I found the permits they had pulled. A permit for perimeter improvement, a permit for aesthetic remediation. They had used that vague, catch-all language to justify the construction of the wall. It was a clever, if not entirely legal, bit of professional deception. They were trying to build a fence and call it a project. But a permit for a fence is not the same thing as a permit for a deep excavation, and that was the fundamental flaw in their entire plan. There were no permits for major earthwork, no permits for structural modification of property, no environmental impact assessment for disturbing the water table. In their arrogance, they had assumed that a general permit, combined with their HOA bylaws, gave them total authority to do whatever they pleased. But you cannot simply dig a 10-foot deep hole around a house in a major city without a specific legally binding permit. This wasn't just a violation of their own bylaws. This was a violation of municipal zoning laws, building codes, and state environmental regulations. Their crime was now no longer a petty, local affair. It was a matter of public safety. Their arrogance had led them to believe that their personal vendetta superseded the law. They had not considered that the city would be an entirely different beast to contend with. Brenda and her board were so focused on my unprofessional water diversion project that they committed a series of their own, far more dangerous and illegal acts. I now had the proof I needed, a clear and undeniable path to exposing their profound incompetence. All I needed was a way to deliver it to the right people. I had a tactical advantage. Brenda and her board never knew they had given me. Since I knew they were watching, their surveillance wasn't a threat. It was a performance stage. I could control the narrative they saw, and as an engineer, I knew how to model their behavior. Their goal was to see me defeated, to watch me break. So I decided to give them exactly what they wanted. Over the next few days, I began my one-man show. I would walk to the edge of the pit and stare down at the sheer face of the earth, as if contemplating my own insignificance. I'd slump on the couch, my face buried in my hands, then peek up just enough to make sure their cameras had seen my despair. I put a few empty cardboard boxes on the floor of my living room and would spend hours staring into them, as if I was on the verge of packing up my life and admitting defeat. I was a digital ghost, a phantom of their own making, and I was feeding them a false narrative of my collapse. While I was playing the part of the broken homeowner, my real work was taking place in the basement. Away from the prying eyes of their cheap security cameras, I was meticulously assembling the final package of evidence: the drone footage, the logs from their own security feed, the documents from my allies proving they had no permits for the excavation. I had printed every piece of evidence and filed it in a waterproof, tamper-proof container. I was creating a physical, unassailable chain of custody. It was the antithesis of the sloppy amateur operation they had run. They were building a wall with brute force. I was building a case with undeniable proof. I could almost see Brenda and her inner circle sitting in their clubhouse, toasting to their victory, laughing at the defeated man on their grainy security feed. They were so confident in the emotional impact of their wall that they never considered I might be using it for my own purposes. They were so busy gloating over my breakdown that they never saw my real master plan, a plan that was moving forward right under their noses. I had given them their triumphant ending, a false sense of security that would make them careless. And carelessness was a vulnerability I was a professional at exploiting. The plan was simple and, I believed, airtight. The Trojan horse, the false narrative of my collapse, was fully operational, feeding Brenda's cameras a daily dose of my supposed defeat. Meanwhile, I was preparing the final, most damning piece of evidence. It couldn't be a document or a digital file. It had to be a physical object, a piece of irrefutable proof. I knew what it was the moment I found the old municipal tunnel. I took a small, sterile container and went down to the base of the pit. Using a small, handheld pump, I drew a sample of the spring water, careful to get it from the source itself. The water was crystalline and cool, and in my professional estimation, it had a unique mineral composition, a specific hydrological signature. I sealed the sample and placed it inside a small waterproof package, along with a simple typed note for Mr. Henderson. The note explained my theory. The HOA isn't just trying to remediate the land. They are trying to divert this specific valuable spring water for a private, for-profit entity. They had been in talks to sell access to the spring to a private bottled water company, a detail I'd uncovered through my own digital sleuthing into Brenda's finances. The wall was not just about control. It was a front for a multi-million-dollar scam. The water sample was the physical proof that would link them to the crime. I carried the package to the small, bricked-over opening of the old tunnel. Using a long-handled grabber I had fashioned from a few gardening tools, I carefully placed the package inside and pushed it through the narrow, dark passage. I had no idea how far it went, but I knew my allies would be at the other end. A few hours later, a single, coded message appeared on my secured message board. Package received. Awaiting analysis. The mission was a success. Brenda and her board thought they had me in a prison. But in their hubris, they had built a secret escape tunnel for my evidence, a back door for my revenge. The paper documents, the digital footage, and now the physical proof were all on the outside. Their smug arrogance had given me the perfect opportunity to strike, and I was just a ghost, an observer waiting for my moment to emerge. I was still in my hole, a digital ghost watching the world through the cold glow of my laptop screen. The day had finally come. My allies, led by Mr. Henderson, were presenting the case to a special session of the City Council. I had arranged for a local news crew to be tipped off, a small act of calculated leverage. They were there, their cameras pointed at the stage where my evidence was about to be laid bare. I watched as Mr. Henderson, a calm, steady figure, stepped up to the podium. He started by showing them the drone footage I had sent, the sweeping, cinematic shots of the monstrous concrete wall from above. I could hear the collective gasp in the council chambers as the full absurdity of the structure was revealed. The news reporter, his voice full of shocked disbelief, narrated the footage, calling it an unprecedented act of suburban aggression. The first piece of the puzzle had landed. Then, Mr. Henderson began to methodically present the rest of the case. He displayed the permits the HOA had pulled, or, more accurately, the permits they hadn't pulled. He showed them the legal paperwork, the city ordinances, the building codes they had so arrogantly ignored. He explained in simple terms how this was not a dispute over a fence, but a massive, illegal excavation that was a threat to public safety. Finally, he held up the lab results from the water sample I had sent out. Brenda and her board, he said, his voice a low, righteous rumble, claimed Adam was hoarding springwater. But this was a cover story. Our hydrological analysis proves that they weren't trying to remediate anything. They were trying to reroute the flow of the spring itself. We have evidence they were in the final stages of a secret deal to sell the rights to this unique natural resource to a private bottled water company. The wall wasn't a punishment for a violation. It was a clandestine construction project designed to conceal their massive multi-million-dollar act of fraud. I watched as the council members' faces went from shocked to furious. The camera panned to the news reporter, his jaw slack. The lie was exposed. The paper trail, the digital footage, and now the physical evidence had all come together, and their house of cards was finally collapsing. The news story was no longer just a local report. It had gone viral. My drone footage, the monstrous, ridiculous concrete wall standing in the middle of a perfectly manicured neighborhood, was trending across every social media platform. The internet had found its new favorite villain, and she was a suburban HOA president. The footage was on an endless loop, a symbol of bureaucratic arrogance and absurd, petty power. The comments were a firestorm of righteous indignation. People were calling it the most Karen thing ever, and a new kind of suburban warfare. They could see the injustice, and now they had an unassailable visual to attach their outrage to. But the wall was just the hook. The real story, the one that turned a viral sensation into a community-wide revolt, was the illegal water deal. My allies' meticulous presentation of the evidence, the missing permits, the financial fraud, the secret dealings with the bottled water company, had lit a match. The neighbors, the same people who had been too afraid to even meet my eyes at the HOA meetings, had seen the truth. They weren't just being ruled by a petty tyrant. They were being defrauded by a criminal enterprise. From inside my silent concrete prison, I watched as the narrative began to unravel. The homeowners, no longer silent and afraid, began to turn on Brenda and her board. I saw them on my live feeds, gathering in the street, their faces no longer passive, but filled with a collective fury. I saw them tearing down the HOA signs, their acts of rebellion small but profoundly satisfying. They were demanding resignations, an audit of the books, and a full investigation. They had been victims of Brenda's arrogance, but now they were a force of nature, a righteous mob. I saw Brenda, frantic and furious, attempting to post a defensive statement on the HOA's website. But it was too late. The tide had turned. The people who she had ruled over with an iron fist, the community she had so diligently policed, was now in open revolt. Their fear had been replaced by a furious indignation, and they were fighting my war for me. Her entire empire, built on a foundation of flimsy bylaws and smug condescension, was crumbling under the weight of a single, undeniable truth. It took less than 24 hours for the public outrage to transform into professional action. The viral storm had drawn the kind of attention Brenda had never intended, and the city, now aware of the illegal excavation, acted swiftly. I was in my living room when I saw a city-owned vehicle pull up to the wall. A single official, a woman in a pressed suit, got out and handed a legal document to the lone security guard who had been left behind. It was a cease and desist order. The guard's confusion was palpable as he read the paper. Within minutes, the remaining crew members packed up their gear. The construction was over. The wall was a symbol of their past hubris, now a monument to their incompetence. But the halt in construction was just the beginning. I watched on my laptop as Mr. Henderson, my wise, retired legal warrior, held a press conference. He stood before a backdrop of local news logos and announced that he had just filed a massive class-action lawsuit on behalf of not just me, but a dozen of the now emboldened homeowners who had joined our cause. He spoke with a quiet, professional fury, detailing the charges: breach of fiduciary duty, property damage, illegal trespass, and fraud. He cited the lack of permits and the concealed water deal as the core of their criminal misconduct. And then the cavalry arrived. Flashing red and blue lights painted stripes across the pristine suburban street. Law enforcement vehicles pulled up to the HOA clubhouse, and uniformed officers began to enter, carrying briefcases and official-looking folders. This wasn't a call about a loud party. This was a criminal investigation. They were there to look into fraud and illegal construction. I saw one officer walk to the edge of the pit and shake his head in utter disbelief, as if he were looking at the world's most ridiculous crime scene. The smug, self-assured look on Brenda's face from the days before was now replaced by a frantic, defensive panic. Her paper-thin empire of bylaws and control was crumbling under the weight of a far more powerful, far more professional, and far more righteous force. The rule of law had finally arrived in Meadow Creek. The sound of a luxury sedan's engine cut through the silence. My laptop screen, still tuned into the HOA's camera feed, showed Brenda's face, now flushed with a mixture of smugness and fury. She had heard about the cease and desist order and the lawsuits, but she was here to see for herself, to gloat one last time. She got out of her car and walked to the edge of the pit, her heels clicking on the pavement. She looked down at me in my hole, a thin, triumphant smile on her face. The look in her eyes was one of pure, unadulterated vindication. She was here for her curtain call, to see the defeat she had worked so hard to engineer. "Well, Adam," she said, her voice echoing down into the pit, a patronizing and overly sweet tone, "I see the city has decided to get involved. I just want you to know how sorry I am that your project had to be handled this way. If only you had complied with the rules, none of this would have been necessary. But as I've always said, actions have consequences." I simply stood there, in the center of my isolated island of land, and looked up at her. I didn't respond to her condescending platitudes. My eyes were not on her, but on the small, discreetly placed news van parked a few yards away, its camera trained on both of us. The reporter, his voice full of shocked disbelief, gave me a subtle nod. The quiet guy up the hill was on a live news feed. "Brenda," I said, my voice calm, level, and amplified by a small, hidden microphone I had set up just for this occasion. "I believe the consequences you're referring to are for a massive class-action lawsuit for fraud, not to mention the potential criminal investigation for your unpermitted, illegal excavation that violates both city and state environmental laws." She froze, her smug smile faltering. "What are you talking about?" she stammered, her voice suddenly losing its perfect composure. "The permits are all in order. We followed procedure." "You filed permits for aesthetic remediation, Brenda," I replied, my voice now a cold, factual delivery. "You didn't file permits for a 10-foot excavation. My hydrological report and the water sample I had analyzed proves you weren't trying to fix a leak. You were trying to divert a valuable natural resource to a private company. That wasn't a punishment for me. It was a business transaction for you. And now, the city, and everyone watching this broadcast, knows exactly what you've done." Her face went pale, her eyes darting between me and the news camera, a visible panic finally setting in. She had come to witness my defeat, but she had walked right into the live televised broadcast of her own. The live feed was now a chaotic scene of flashing red and blue lights, a stark, theatrical backdrop for the final act. More law enforcement vehicles had arrived, and uniformed officers, their faces grim and professional, began to move through the panicked crowd. They were no longer there to ask questions. They were there to make arrests. I watched as Brenda, her face still pale with shock from my televised counterattack, was confronted by a detective. I saw the glint of steel as the cuffs were placed on her wrists, her panicked expression a far cry from the smug, triumphant smile she had worn just hours before. The detective read her rights, his voice a steady, official monotone, and she was led away to a waiting police car. Her board members, who had scattered like roaches, were rounded up and met the same fate. The smug architects of the concrete wall were now nothing more than common criminals, and the irony was so exquisite, so perfectly calibrated, that it felt like a work of art. Brenda and her board were not being arrested for the thousands of dollars in petty fines they had levied. They weren't being arrested for a simple homeowners association dispute. They were being arrested for a laundry list of serious crimes: wire fraud for their secret water deal, conspiracy, and, in a final, stunning act of poetic justice, for trespassing and illegal construction. They had built a wall to legally and physically cut me off, to declare my property separate from their community, but in their haste, they had violated so many laws that the final, decisive blow came in the form of a trespassing charge. They were being arrested for illegally entering and modifying a property that they themselves had declared to be outside of their jurisdiction. I stood in my hole, surrounded by the monument to their arrogance, and watched as their empire of beige envelopes and petty rules crumbled before a far greater power. It was the calm triumph of logic over emotion, of a methodical, righteous plan against a flimsy, overconfident scheme. They had built a wall to keep me from the world, and in doing so, they had built their own perfect prison. The sound of the jackhammers was, for once, a welcome noise. It was the sound of righteous demolition, the breaking apart of a monument to arrogance. The city had hired a professional crew to tear down the wall. The same company that had built the prison was now tasked with dismantling it, their expressions grim and professional as they undid their own shoddy work. The concrete panels, so quickly erected in the dead of night, were now carefully lifted by a crane, a heavy, symbolic sigh of a project gone terribly wrong. It took weeks for my property to be fully restored. The crew worked tirelessly to fill in the 10-foot deep pit, bringing in thousands of cubic feet of clean, fresh soil. They carefully regraded the land, restoring the gentle slope of my yard. I was out there every day, a silent observer of the restoration, checking their work with a professional eye, making sure they were putting the land back exactly as it was. The final act of their remediation was to put up a simple, wooden fence, a gesture of goodwill and a far cry from the monstrous wall that had once stood there. The last scene was a peaceful one. The contractors had left. The dust had settled. I was back in my yard, surrounded by the peaceful suburban soundtrack of chirping birds and distant lawnmowers. I walked to the banks of my restored spring, the water bubbling and gurgling with a life I had worked so hard to preserve. I took a deep breath, the air clean and smelling of wet earth and new life. I had triumphed not with anger or force, but with a simple, quiet, and professional resolve. I had out-documented them, out-thought them, and ultimately outsmarted them. The wall was gone, a bad memory, but the lesson remained. True wealth isn't measured in dollars or property values, but in a clean spring and a clear conscience. And sometimes, the quiet guy up the hill, the one with all the facts and a professional demeanor, is the most powerful force in the neighborhood. The final panels were removed from my property this morning, the last of the concrete fortress hauled away on a flatbed truck. The quiet that has descended over the neighborhood isn't the oppressive silence of fear anymore. It's a calm, a sense of peace that has been hard-won. The HOA, as a legal entity, has been effectively dissolved. My allies, the reluctant homeowners who finally found their courage, have taken over, a new democratic board elected from the ashes of the old. I see them now, not as strangers with masked faces, but as neighbors, and we share a common look of quiet understanding. The experience changed Meadow Creek. It was a wake-up call, a public theatrical demonstration of what happens when you give a little power to the wrong people. The wall became a symbol, not just of Brenda's arrogance, but of a community's complacency. We all learned that the cost of doing nothing is far greater than the effort of standing up. The town, once so obsessed with conformity and aesthetics, is now defined by its newfound sense of collective purpose. We've started a community garden, and the HOA's first act was to reroute a portion of my spring's overflow to a new public fountain. I think back to that first beige envelope, to the words non-conforming use and aesthetic remediation. They seemed so insignificant at the time, just bureaucratic nonsense. But those tiny details, those small, seemingly meaningless words, were the beginning of it all. It wasn't the wall itself that defeated them. It was the hubris that led them to build it, and the paper trail they left behind. My victory wasn't won with a fight, but with a plan. It was won with a logbook, a drone, and a water sample. Brenda's criminal enterprise, her grand, theatrical scheme, was undone by a simple fact. I was a professional, and she was an amateur. She saw an inconvenience. I saw an opportunity. She saw a quiet guy up the hill. I saw a chance to expose the truth. I often reflect on what matters. Is it the perfect lawn, the conforming mailbox, the meticulously worded bylaw? Or is it something more profound? I now know the answer. True wealth isn't measured in dollars or property value, but in a clean spring and a clear conscience.